in any school, you're okay. People aren't going to get excited about that. But we had 2 full-time alternative education programs running year-round. Typically, those are kids that we push out of school. If you take the push-outs and put them together with our actual dropouts, we were exceeding the limit for our community. Other questions they asked us was, how much do you spend on vandalism? And they had a very strict definition of vandalism. It came out to $12,000. I was appalled. I mean, I never... The grant definition of vandalism tended to include just about every scuff mark in the school, it seemed. But so I think that the amount did get inflated, but nevertheless, I was very surprised. The other important question they asked was, how many different kids did you suspend this year? Not how many suspensions, but how many different kids got suspended from your school. And it turned out there were 90 kids in that school that were driving us nuts. Now, some of those kids, of course, have been suspended once or twice, some of them many times. They're repeat offenders. When I went into this, I never said to the staff or to the parents or to the kids, for that matter, that we're not going to suspend kids, we're not going to have detentions. I believed in all of that, and I believed that you needed to have that to have a good school. However, at the end of the year, when we did our sort of post-test kind of inventory, we were really surprised the change that had taken place in our school. Our vandalism cost dropped to $1,200 for the entire year, using the same definition. We stopped using detentions. I'm not opposed to detentions, but we just felt there were better ways to deal with things. And you can still use all that stuff as we go through the sessions talking about these things. I don't want to imply that you can't use detentions or anything, but maybe there's some other things we can use to couple with what you're doing already that might make some sense. Our dropout rate went to, well, the highest during the 7 years that we implemented this program, the highest was 2.4%, the lowest was 0.5%. After I left the school, they did a study a few years later on the dropout situation. They discovered that 90% of the kids that dropped out of that school returned and got a legitimate diploma in the school. I attribute part of that to the fact that we kept calling the kids even though they dropped out. How you doing, Ernie? Oh, pretty good. Still got your job? No, I quit. The guy I worked for is a jerk. So what are you going to do? I'm going to get another job. When are you going to do that? When I get some time, you see. So you say, well, why don't you get in the school bus and come on in the morning and take a look at the jobs posted in the guidance office. Now, see, in the old days, I never would have allowed that. Because in the old days, my theory was he might infect the bus. You know, he'll, by the time we get to school, we'll have a busload of dropouts. You let one do it, they're all going to want to do it. And we use that theory, I think, more than we like to admit in our business. But some of the other things that we noticed, besides the vandalism and the dropout rate, no detentions, the suspension rate, and by the way, we closed one of our alternative schools. We didn't need it because it seemed that more and more kids were getting along in the regular program. Suspensions, there were 9 for the whole year. 9 different kids from 90 the year before. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And all 9 kids were drug and alcohol violations. And everybody here knows what a beer drinker does when you kick him out for 5 days. He's not home saying, oh, I guess I better shape up. He's home drinking more beer, drugs, or whatever they're into. Knowing that, because my experience is with kids are into that kind of behavior. Now, with younger children, it might not be drugs and alcohol yet, at least we hope it isn't. It's probably the more passive, lonely kind of kid that we're dealing with. And when these kids get older, if we watch their behavior, they tend to be the kids when they get older get into these kinds of activities sometimes. But they don't disrupt the school in an outwardly way. My experience is that the drug and alcohol culture in the school, or the kids who are abusing these kinds of things, tend to be very passive. They cut class, they hide in the bathrooms, they're late to class, but they're not disruptive in an outwardly way. So knowing that, we went to the school board and we said, would you consider changing the policy on mandatory suspensions? Because we know we're driving the kids out when we do this. So they did. They changed the policy. The result of that was the last 6 years I was at the school, we did not suspend one student from our school. Now, if you told Jim Fitzpatrick that you could run 1,000+ student high school and not suspend kids, I would have put $1,000 on the table and bet you'll ruin your school. Because I was a firm believer in all of that. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I've been gone from that school, I think, almost about 10 years now. And off and on, they have suspended kids. But generally speaking, they've pretty much followed the process that we'll be talking about. I went on to some other positions, and anyway, I spend most of my time now working with schools trying to promote this idea rather than the old stuff that I was very confident that would really shape schools up. And a little different process that helps put responsibility on the kids. So what we're going to be doing through the next 3 sessions is we're basically going to be talking about a different approach to dealing with kids. I don't care whether it's in the hallway, in the cafeteria, in the classroom, dealing with homework problems. How can we get kids to take responsibility for their behavior instead of us putting it all on our shoulders, which everybody knows is a very exhausting part of our job. And letting go of that and trying to get kids to take responsibility, I think, is something important that we have to teach kids. I think over time we have, for lack of maybe alternatives, we have sort of by default taken a lot of this responsibility and put on our shoulders in schools. And having tried it both ways, for the majority of my career, the traditional way versus 7 years of what I'm going to be talking about, I can tell you from my own personal experience, this way is a lot easier. It's tough in some regard too, but it's a lot easier in terms of going home at night and thinking about why am I teaching, why am I a principal, or whatever our job is in the school. So just to give you an idea of how the agenda will flow, I'm going to start out first of all by talking about a theory of behavior that may be a little different from what a lot of us learned. And then I'm going to take a look at some of the things that go on in schools and what we do in schools and how when kids are in school, what are they dealing with, fitting in and so on, and how we deal with them as adults in the building so that we have a knowledge base to work from. My experiences in our business is we all get jobs teaching. We show up at the classroom or we show up at the school. They give us our assignments. But the school rarely sits down as a faculty and has a discussion about what do we believe about kids or what do we believe about behavior. It's just assumed that everybody knows. But you know as well as I do when that happens, you have as many different ideas of what we ought to do with kids in the building as there are adults working in the school. So kids end up getting a very different message from the adults. So we're going to talk about that theory. We're going to talk about how kids behave in school, what they're doing, the importance of fitting in, what's my role as a student here, how do I fit in the school, how do I fit in the classroom. Then we're going to talk about success and failure and how that impacts on people. And the third session we'll end up talking about the actual nuts and bolts of what are we going to do when kids misbehave and get out of line. How are we going to deal with it in a way that truly will begin to put responsibility on them. So to sort of set the stage and to start with, I just want to have you take a look at some statistics that sort of maybe illustrate for us the importance of teaching responsibility to kids. And just if you look at them, you can see that there's some indications in our society we better be doing something. Over 20 teens kill each other daily in the United States with firearms. 8 million teens drink alcohol a week. 7,700 teens become sexually active per day. They drink 1.5 gallons of wine coolers per teen per year. Now it occurred to me some teens don't drink wine coolers. Some teens drink rum and vodka and tequila, and some teens don't drink, and some teens drink beer. So the ones that are drinking wine coolers must be drinking an awful lot more than 1.5 gallons to bring that up to 1.5 gallons per teen per year. Almost 2,500 teens drop out of school per day during the school year, and then you and I support a lot of those people and their offspring. We did a survey in one of the schools where I worked, school districts where I worked. It wasn't where I did the stuff I'm talking about. It was a different one. And we asked the dropouts, and you can't have a dropout night at school and expect them to show up so you can do your survey. You have to talk to them wherever you run into town. And we asked them, when did you think you first might not finish school? Or when did you get the feeling that you might not graduate? We were surprised at first, but of course it made an awful lot of sense to us the more we thought about it. The number of kids who could tell us they remembered the day that they got that feeling. Some of them even remembered whether it was morning or afternoon. And they said things to us like, when Mr. Smith said to me in the 5th grade, "Are you going to be like your brother?" That's when I first got the feeling I might not graduate. But it could be the 7th grade. It could be the 3rd grade. Because everybody in this room knows these things all don't start when they're teenagers. Chance that teens will attempt suicide. 1 in 10 for boys, 1 in 5 for girls. 1 million teen pregnancies per year in the United States. That's over 2,700 a day. 600,000 are born, although that one is decreasing a little bit because the next figure is increasing a little bit. There are more pregnancies being terminated, and 80% of those girls are pregnant again within 18 months. Now, the reason I put these up here is just to get us thinking about behavior sort of in a general way, but also to think about it in terms of how are we going to deal with some of these things. For example, teenage pregnancy. Teenage girls get pregnant for a reason. It just doesn't happen. And teenage pregnancy is a problem in our society. I don't think anyone would argue with that. It's also a symptom of a more basic problem. Many times teenage girls end up getting pregnant because it was worth the risk of pregnancy for some love and affection and attention from some significant person in my life. And I have seen this happen in communities where I've worked as a principal. That teenage mother will bring the little infant into school to visit her teachers, and she is afforded a great deal of attention and love from adults and all of us and her peers. But when that infant becomes 18 months old and 2 years old, where are the friends? They're not hanging around as much because it's not as much fun to bring a 2-year-old around or an 18-month-old around as it is an infant. So if I want that kind of attention from my friends again, what's a way for me to get it? I'll be pregnant again. So one of the things we need to look at with the figures we were just looking at is we need to recognize that while they're problems, they're symptoms of more basic problems in our society. We love to tinker with symptoms. It's easier. Two of the best places to look at that are state legislatures and Congress. Because solving problems is much tougher. And we needed to take a look at, we discovered in our school, at what are the causes of the problems in our school. Discipline is a problem in our school. I mean, everybody knows that. Wherever I go, it's a problem. It's also a symptom of a more basic problem in school. Kids who do well in school, kids who see a light at the end of the tunnel, kids who see relevance to the work that they're asked to do are wonderful kids to have in our classrooms. They understand the system, and they will do pretty much anything we ask them to do. Kids who can't see that relevance, who don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, are typically the ones that are giving us a hard time. So one of the things that I'll be stressing is we need to define what the problem is with this particular student, and we will also take a look at it in the framework of a theory of behavior, and maybe how can we then solve the problem. Because if we really want to make some headway, in one regard, we're going to have to start picking them off one at a time to really make to get some progress. And the other thing, too, I think we need to let go of some myths about behavior. There's a lot of myths floating around in our business when it comes to dealing with kids. And you have all attended faculty meetings where the meetings sometimes discipline is the topic. And if you listen to what's going on in the room and in the meeting, there are a lot of myths about behavior. And if we think about it, for example, some of the things that we often talk about is consistency and fairness, and the idea of equality and fairness. Compliance is discipline or responsibility. We are lucky in our business when you really think about it. We have an awful lot of kids that come to school that are very compliant. We forget about them sometimes because we're busy thinking about the kids who are acting out. But a lot of kids come to school and they will do just about anything we ask them to do. That, to me, however, well, it's fine and it makes our job easier, may or may not have anything to do with responsible behavior. The real test for discipline is, what are the kids going to do when my back's turned? What are the kids going to do when the adult isn't right there to tell them what to do? So that's what we're going to be thinking about too, is how do we get kids to be self-disciplined, make good judgments on their own, versus constantly looking to us and asking, what do you want me to do now? Is this what you want me to do, kind of thing, because that's where we end up putting all those burdens on our shoulders. Some of the others that were on the list, let one do it, they're all going to want to do it. Something needs to happen to the kids. I mean, sometimes, you send kids to the office, nothing happens to them. See, that's the problem. They're not afraid to go to the office anymore. Misbehavior is wrong. I think if we could just think about behavior in terms of all behavior has a purpose. Right or wrong is another whole issue, but the kid that's doing this horrible thing in our school, there's a reason for that. Not that we're going to tolerate it, but there is a purpose to that behavior. So I'm going to take just one of these, and I'm going to run through a scenario to sort of illustrate in the school business how we get ourselves into trouble with an attempt to try and control all these behaviors. I wished I had a nickel for every time a kid said to me, Mr. Fitz, that's not fair. And many times when kids say that, what they're really talking about is equality or sameness. Now, let's just take a typical behavior that might manifest itself K through 12. I mean, there are kids in the elementary school and in the high school who have this incredible need to wander all over the place. In the elementary classroom, kindergarten, first grade, you get ready to do your work and you're saying, okay, class, let's sit down and get our books out. There's Ernie over there under the desk, pushing the other kids, talking, not paying any attention. When they get older, these kids not only wander around the classroom, they wander around the entire building. And this is a problem, because if someone should come in from the outside, a parent, somebody from the community, my goodness, we could, they'll think we don't have any control, and it makes us nervous. I remember thinking as a principal, that one of the nice things is during class time is to make sure the kids are in their rooms and not wandering around the building. But there are kids that will do that. So, what do we do when we have these kinds of problems? I remember particularly near the end of the school year, March, April, at faculty meetings, but there's too many kids in the hall during class. Someone else, I know, we got to get a handle on this. Who's letting them out anyway? Let's see it. So what we usually do is we appoint a committee. And the committee's job is to look into these things. So the committee calls up other schools and they get copies of codes of conduct and handbooks and they lay it all out and they compare them all. And someone notices in our handbook, it says if you're caught in the hall without permission or without a pass, you get a warning on the first offense, second offense, you get a detention. And some astute member says, my goodness, there's the problem. You see, you get a warning from one teacher in the morning, another teacher later in the morning, you get 6 or 7 warnings for the detention. So what do we need to do? Well, we got to have the detention, first offense. So we write this handbook all up, we change all the loopholes in the code of conduct, and we're all excited. We send home this beautiful looking booklet to parents on what we're going to be doing this year. I know some schools will make parents sign they've read those things. There's a leap of faith if I ever saw one. But anyway, we do what we need to do to try and get a handle on discipline. And we start the school year. So, I was always criticized, by the way, as an administrator for 2 things. One of them was, Fitz, you're always in the office. The other one was, Fitz, you're never in the office. Some of the people would say, Fitz, you need to be more visible. You say, oh, okay, I'll work on that. But anyway, we start the school year, and I'm out looking for kids. And we're not going to mess around this year. We're taking care of this hall wandering. And I see Don in the hall. Now, Don is one of these students who's a known wanderer in the school, you see. And, this brings excitement to an assistant principal or a principal who will trap a kid this early in the school year. So I say, Don, you got a pass? And Don says, no, I ain't got one. I said, what do you mean you don't have one? I told you I don't got one. Mr. Jones won't give me one. He wouldn't give me one last year. I know I'm not going to get one this year. And for some kids, that may not be too far from the truth. You see, because Don watches the good kids go up to Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, can I have a pass? I got to go to the bathroom. Mr. Jones, can I have a pass? I got to go to the library. Don goes up. Mr. Jones, can I have a pass? I got to go to the bathroom. Why didn't you go before he came in, Don? You know, that's what that time's for. Now, I'll let you go today, but after today, I expect you to be taking care of these things. Okay. A couple of days later, he tries something more legitimate. Mr. Jones, can I have a pass? I got to go to the library. Do you know where it is, Don? What do you need the library for? You see? And shortly into the school year, in subtle and not so subtle ways, the Dons in our schools recognize that they're sort of second-class citizens. Either with a little sarcasm, a little mini lecture, or whatever. So what these kids typically do is, rather, because they get tired of that, and all of us in this room would get tired of that if we were treated that way. So what Don does is he decides to take his chances by being in the hall and not ask Mr. Jones for permission at all. Now, I'm not justifying his behavior. He's breaking the rules, and we have to deal with that. All I'm talking about right now is, how do some of these kids end up doing what they're doing? So I see him in the hall, and I bring him down to the office. And I say, Don, you know what it means this year if you're caught in the hall without a pass? No. Well, we sent it home in the handbook. Well, we didn't get one. Well, you're going to have to stay for detention. And I get this all worked out with Don, and I send him on his way. Out in the outer office is a teacher friend of mine, Roland. Roland is one of those teachers who lives in a black and white world. He's been saying for years at faculty meetings, committee meetings, if we just followed the rules around here, we wouldn't have any problems. And he sticks his head in my office. He says, geez, I heard you in there with Don, Fitz. Good job, good job. So that makes me feel good. Now, a little later in the week, I'm still out looking for kids, or maybe the second week of school. I see Marilyn in the hall. Marilyn is a model student. She has never done anything wrong in this school. She has followed the rules. She has been in the school play. She's been on the athletic team. She's taken all the AP honors courses we have to offer. She's just been a wonderful volunteer when we need volunteers in school. Her senior year, her counselor says, Marilyn, I think if you really want to get into these competitive colleges, you ought to be thinking about sort of taking an elective to put in your, in your program here to look better. So her senior year, she takes studio art with Mrs. Stark, the art teacher. Nice little course, only for a semester. And she goes to art class. And Mrs. Stark says to Marilyn, Marilyn, I've changed my mind. We're not going to do pottery today. We're going to go outdoors and do watercolors. Go to your locker, get your brushes, meet us out front by the flagpole. Marilyn, being a responsible student, says, Mrs. Stark, I need a pass. Now, I don't know about your schools, but any schools I've worked in, art teachers are always a little too right-brained to worry about passes or things like that. And says, Marilyn, just go to your locker, take care of it. If you have any trouble, I'll talk to the principal or somebody. She goes on about her business. Now, I'm in the hall looking for kids. I see Marilyn. I don't even have to speak to her. She comes right up to me. Mr. Fitz, I don't have a pass. Mrs. Verman told me to come out here and get my brushes. Do you want me to go get a pass? And what do I say? It's okay. Next time, Marilyn. No problem. The only trouble is Roland's nearby. The next faculty meeting. I'd like a clarification of the administration on the pass policy. I just want to know if we're going to have administrative support this year or not. See, that's the problem. We're not consistent. Okay. Now, we are now in the second week of school. And the adults in the building have already screwed up the very system that we have sent home to the parents. But who are we blaming? The kids. The kids. But we're screwing it up. Now, the painful part is we've got 160 days to go. Because parents by now and kids by now, because the kids go home and tell the parents, and the parents tell the kids, look, I don't want to hear from the school. Keep your nose clean. Watch what you're doing. They may be messing something up down there, but I don't want to hear about it. I'm tired of this. Same old thing every year. Now, this is painful for lots of different reasons. One of them is Roland and the Rolands in the school, and you all know who they are in your schools, are harping on this stuff week after week, day after day, throughout the school year. The kids have written off pretty much everything. I'm not talking about bottom lines here. I'm not talking about guns and weapons. I'm talking about the day-to-day stuff that we have to deal with. And it's annoying, and we get at each other, because we start talking about it. You know, there's some teachers that aren't asking kids for passes. I thought we were all going to be asking kids for passes. You see, that's the problem. We're not consistent. And some days I did keep the Marylands after school because maybe I was being criticized too much and thought, well, okay. So I keep Maryland after school. So what happens many times when I would keep the Marylands after school? Well, one of two things. Let's say she's supposed to stay for detention for an hour. Probably after about 30 minutes, I probably end up saying, Marilyn, you know, it's okay. If you got a way to get home, you know, I know you're not a problem here. Or her parents will be in. And her parents want to know why, when 4 years of school, when our Marilyn has never done anything wrong, you think you're going to have a better school if you make an example out of our daughter. What's the matter with you? Do you really think this is going to improve your school? And you know what? They're right. And I can remember sometimes trying to defend myself with those parents. Well, it's a policy. The committee came up with it over the summer, and we're trying to crack down on discipline. So I'm not saying I agree with all of it necessarily. And then what? Those parents probably go out in their car in the parking lot, and they're scratching their heads. My God, no wonder this place is messed up. Listen to the fool that's running it, you see. So what we need to think about, and what we need to really sort of talk about, is where do we want the consistency? Because sometimes we think the consistency needs to be with the consequences, when actually where we need to have the consistency is in the treatment of kids. So the bottom line then, in this little scenario that I want you to think about, is the treatment of kids is equal. Consequences should be different for different kids. And when you think about it, that's what we end up trying to do anyway. I mean, one of the things that we'll be talking about a little bit later is basic needs and so on. But you know as well as I do that when you're walking down the hall and you see a Marilyn in the hall, you don't want to turn this into a bigger problem. She's a responsible kid. And if you see Don in the hall day after day after day, we have to do something about it. But we get so hung up sometimes in our business on something has to happen every single time. And I know some schools that have in their handbooks, first offense, second offense, third offense. And then look what we do when we're trying to implement it. We screw it all up. So we lose credibility by the second week of school. We've drilled a hole in the boat, several holes in the boat, and then we're trying to keep it afloat for the next 160 days. That's hard work. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not talking about bottom lines. I'm not talking about weapons, violent kinds of behavior. What I'm talking about is the day-to-day stuff. When I started going around with my dog and pony show, and I would ask to get talks, give talks, and when I, started going around to different parts of the country, I thought, my gosh, am I really going to be able to relate to all these different communities and so on? And my hunch actually turned out to be pretty much on the mark. The big stuff really is not what's bugging us in this business. It's the day-to-day little stuff that's driving us nuts. I mean, weapons and violence are easy to take care of. You call the police, hey, you're out of here, done. And we talk about it, and yes, it makes even maybe the TV programs and the press. But after about a week, it's gone. We're back to business. And what are we complaining about? Not guns and weapons. We're complaining about the homework isn't on time. There's too many kids that are late. There's too many kids in the hall. These kids are beating each other up on the playground, and they're messing around. They're not responding. That's the stuff that makes our job irritating. So I think if we pay a little attention to how we deal with those kinds of problems, some things can happen in the school that'll make our job a little more pleasant and a little easier to deal with. So we got to let go of some of the myths. The issue of equality and fairness is one, and the treatment of kids should be equal. So what I want to do to begin with is I want to talk about a theory of behavior, and this will follow along with the first page of your printed materials that you have, because we need to have some common language when we talk about the behavior of kids. Otherwise, it's left up to chance. then we have a bunch of adults in the building dealing with upwards to thousands, hundreds of kids in many, many different ways. Now, I'm going to use a theory that is quite different from what I learned in school, but I've come to really adhere to it and believe in it as a pretty good description of why people do what they do. And this is a theory developed by William Powers out of the University of Chicago. He wrote the book Behavior, the Control of Perception. If you really want to get started thinking about some of these ideas, I think I'd recommend Glasser's book Control Theory to start with. And they're down at the bottom of that first page for you to take a look at. But every theory of behavior, I don't care whether it's Freud, Adler, Jung, Maslow, starts out with a set of needs or drives or motivations or whatever you want to call them. And I don't care whose you use. I mean, you could use Freud's. But the point is, there are a set of needs or motivations that we need to take a look at. I happen to use Glasser's because I've done a lot of stuff with his ideas, but use whoever you want. He says we have 5 basic needs. One of them, and the first one, is the need to survive. Universal in the animal kingdom. Every animal is born with instructions, genetic instructions to survive. Human beings, because we have this wonderful brain, we have additional needs. And they are psychological. One of them is the need to belong. In parentheses, we might want to put to give and receive love. It's the one thing we need to give away to get in our lives. It doesn't do much good to be in a relationship with somebody and take the approach, I'll be nicer to her when she starts being nicer to me. In other words, withholding love to get love doesn't work very well. In fact, that'll probably be a very short relationship or a long, painful, difficult relationship. And you know as well as I do, we've got kids in school who have an incredible need to belong to a group of friends of some kind and have people around them because it fulfills this need for love. The next one is the need for power. We're talking about personal power here. We're not talking about power over other people. We're talking about feeling important about what I do. Might be a way to think about that one. Making a difference. Ask a group of kids, when do you feel important in school? When do you feel like you make a difference here? Even high-performing academic kids will rarely mention academics. They talk about baseball, football, basketball, chorus, band, drama. You see, if I say the wrong line in the play, it makes a difference. If I step out of bounds with a ball, it makes a difference. If I play the wrong note in the concert, it makes a difference. If I get a C in reading, an A in reading, a B in reading, there's no real connection to anybody else. And one of the ways to address this in school in terms of the curriculum is, which has been around certainly, is cooperative learning or something along that line, which tends, because then I have a connection to the other people that are working on this academic enterprise with me. And if I don't do my part, it will impact on other people. And the idea here is the more that we pay attention to the basic needs, when we talk about these problems with kids, whether it's in the classroom or in the hallway or on the bus, the more success we're going to have if we go back to these things and think about them and define what the problem is. The next one is the need for freedom. In parentheses, you might want to put choices. This one used to get me in a lot of trouble in the old days because one of my jobs, of course, and clearing the halls when you start school in the morning or in between classes, there were always the regulars. And the regulars would be kids that were constantly referred to me for being late to class or whatever. And let's say, for example, Judy and Jackie are 2 girls that constantly get reported late to class, late to their room. And I get tired of this because it's annoying. And I'm walking down the hall, and there I see them right outside the girls' room. And I know in 30 seconds, they have to be in their classroom. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get these girls into the room, and then I don't have to deal with Roland or whoever's going to be complaining about the fact that I don't do a good job and so on. So I say, okay, Judy, Jackie, come on, get your room. Hurry up, come on. Sometimes in the old days, the old Jim Fitzpatrick, my tone of voice, my body language was enough to sort of give these kids, some kids in school, a sense that we don't have the same choices that other kids get here. So what happens? Judy says, we have to go to the bathroom first. Now I have a problem on my hands. I've just told these girls to get to their room, and they're telling me, well, we will, but on conditions. And if Roland's nearby, I've really got a problem, because he'll be in the teacher's room telling everybody, oh, they don't even listen to him. So, I've got a classic tiny power struggle on my hands. I have to win this. If I want the kind of recognition and support from the faculty, you better believe I need to win this. So what do? Jackie, you get to your room. Judy, you come down to the office. I need to speak to you. You can use the bathroom in the office. A classic case in the old days where I would take a relatively small problem and I would pump this thing up and turn it into a nice big problem. So one of the questions I think we need to be asking ourselves as we start to think about behavior in school, dealing with kids, is a very, very basic question, and that is, what am I doing? Not what are the kids doing, what am I doing? It'll help you at home with your own family. As most of this stuff, as we go through it, you can apply it in all kinds of places in your life besides just school or work. But what am I doing? Typically what we do when we have problems in our life, the first thing we think about is, whose fault is it? Out there somewhere. So think about our behavior. That was a classic case where maybe and before we're done with the sessions, I can show you how if I had dealt with that just a little differently, I wouldn't have turned this into a bigger problem. And then what? It takes more time. It takes more time to deal with it. And then you've got other people watching you. Because some faculty members would probably watch me and say, it's about time someone confronted these girls. And some other faculty may say, why is he doing that? That's not necessary. So, critical one, this can get us in trouble lots of times. You watch in a school, you watch your colleagues, and watch yourself. Many times one of the ways we get ourselves into trouble is with this one right here. The next one is the need for fun. In parentheses, you might want to put pleasure, entertainment, recreation. I'll give you a one-liner to remember. This may help you. Focus follows fun. Focus follows fun. Have a little fun at the beginning of the day, beginning of the activity, beginning of the class, depending on the grade levels and so on. And then do your work. Think about this. What's the first thing you hope a banquet speaker does when he steps up to the podium after dinner? Tell a joke. Yeah. Something at least of humor, of pleasure, to make that connection with the audience. And next time you're in a situation like that, feel how sort of the energy in the room changes as soon as that connection is made. The audience is ready to listen. Think about what we do in schools sometimes. I mean, I can remember as a teacher, kids come in the room, settle down, get to work. That's the trouble with you kids. You come in here, you know what you're supposed to be doing. Class, have we been over this before? Or that's all that's the trouble with you kids. All you want to do is have fun around here. We've got work to do. We have any time left at the end of the day, left end of the period, we'll have some fun. Right now, get to work. I always had it backwards. But both of those cases are classic cases where my behavior is making my job more difficult. But I'm blaming the kids, of course. All they want to do is have fun. They're not ready. They're not prepared. Whatever. It doesn't mean you have to be a comedian. A teacher friend of mine, when they started doing some of these ideas, had a little trivia questions at the beginning of class. and didn't count towards grades, didn't count on it, but just some fun. The kids were in the room much more readily and paying attention and so on because of just that little activity. Now some people go, oh, it's not my job, I shouldn't have to do that, I'm here to teach. Well, then that's going to be probably a painful day and a painful year for you. And it was when I used to try and use those controlling behaviors and managing behaviors day after day after day. I thought it was my job. Because most of what I'm talking about here, and maybe in some way I might be critical, I'm criticizing myself. I'm not talking about other people. I'm just saying, let's raise some questions, and one of the important ones is, what am I doing? Or as a faculty, what are we doing? Now, if what you're doing isn't working, I suggest you stop it. Try something else. If things get worse, you can always go back to what doesn't work. But unless you ask the question, we just keep muddling along, which is what I did for a long time in the business. Now, these are the genetic needs, they're the basic needs that we're going to be talking about. If you think you have others, some mutation in your family, you're welcome to add them. But that's what we're going to be using. Now, this theory starts out with sort of a basic idea that from the time we're born until we die, we begin to put perceptions or pictures in our mind of how we want and don't want things to be in our life. Mother, father, dog, cat, house, brother, sister, and all these kinds of things. They can be real, they can be imagined. For example, I have a picture up here of Alaska. I've never been to Alaska. But I have all kinds of perceptions in my mind of how I'd like Alaska to be. When I go to Alaska, which I intend to do someday, I will compare what I see, taste, smell, and touch in the outside world with my internal world or perceptual world with my sensory system, because that's how we understand the outside world, with our sensory system. The degree to which the things that I experience in the outside world match up with my internal world will be the degree to which my trip to Alaska is a need-satisfying experience. The only reason animals behave is to meet these basic needs. It's the only reason. So when we watch kids in school and we're dealing with problems, behaviors in school, one of the first questions we need to ask ourselves is, how is school or my classroom meeting this kid's needs? And it may or may not be your particular classroom. Let's say you're in a middle school or a high school. I mean, you may be dealing with some very difficult behaviors from the student, and it's sort of out of character. Well, one of the things that we may be dealing with is there's a problem somewhere else in the school. And it's pretty hard for anybody, any of us, to just shut out everything off completely as we go around the building. So, this is sort of the basis from which we're going to operate. There's one other little thing I need to get down here so that it matches up with your printed material, and it won't be quite as well done as that, but there are 4 parts to our behavior system, 4 components. On one of the rear wheels on this car is one of them, and that is feelings. The other rear wheel is physiology. One of the front wheels is actions, the things that we do. The other front wheel is thoughts, how we think. The only part of our behavior system that we have direct control over are actions and thoughts. We do not directly control feelings and physiology. I can't say to Mary here, feel better, hurry up. She can't do that. But depending on how she turns her front wheels will determine whether she feels better or worse. Now what this means is we have to change some of our language when we talk about behavior. I can't say, for example, you make me feel bad. You make me angry. No, I choose anger to control the world to get what I want. If we were to draw a name out of the hat here, of those of you that are present. And the rest of us could become invisible, and we could watch you at home and watch you at work. Before too long, we would probably see you with the very same kind of conflict. Obviously, the environment is different, but the very same kind of conflict. At home, I might raise my voice, just a touch. Or I might use something that lets people know I'm upset, I'm angry. Because by doing that at home, I can control my world and get what I want. At work, however, I wouldn't behave like that. Because with my colleagues and so on, that wouldn't be the appropriate thing to do. Now, if we were to think about behavior in the more traditional way, sort of the stimulus-response approach, we might be saying, faced with that stimulus, I have a conditioned response that I use. That out there makes me angry, makes me upset. We choose all of our behaviors, every one of them. And the ones that work for us, we use a lot. Raising my voice in the classroom, for example. Let the kids know we're ready to get started, maybe, or that I mean business. Whatever it is, but we choose our behaviors. And I think it helps maybe to think about this in terms of a car. If I don't like what I'm getting, then maybe I ought to think about, and we actually, if you try this with kids, you get a little car with the wheels turn in the front, and label the four wheels. You can ask kids, is the way you're steering your car going to get you what you want? And it can open up a very interesting discussion with kids. Now, obviously, you don't do it in the middle of class. You do that maybe at a time when you've got some time to talk to a kid who's maybe having some problems. And I think you'll find that kids do sort of begin to realize, maybe I have more control. Kids love, in my experience, love to blame other kids, blame the teachers, blame their parents, blame whoever. It's not my fault. I was just standing here. If he hadn't started, I wouldn't have done this, kind of thing. Say, well, we can cut through all that now. We don't have to waste a lot of time talking about it. What did you want to have happen? And we'll talk about some of the questions that are appropriate in terms of trying to get them to take some responsibility. So, this is sort of what we're going to operate with. And I'm going to put this into action, and we're just going to take a generic sort of problem, and then we'll use an example in school. But I want you to call up on your computer screen where your car is parked out here in the parking lot. You can see it out there. And when you approach or when you leave today, you notice that you have a flat tire, your windows are broken, and you've got several of the belongings and things you had in your car missing. In this case, what you see in the outside world does not match up with your internal world. When things don't match up, in other words, you don't get what you want, your brain basically tells your little car here, signals your car, you need to go into action. You need to start taking some steps to control this, to get this to match up. In other words, you got to fix your car. Now, this is something you can't do like that, but at least you'll get started. So what happens? Mary goes out, looks at the car, she comes back in, she starts screaming and yelling at the receptionist, and I can't believe there's no security around here, and carries on and on and on. Mary Jane goes out, looks at the car, changes the tire, goes home, calls her insurance agent. Marilyn goes out, looks at the car, goes down to the local pub, has 3 margaritas, comes back and hopes it's fixed. All three people did the best they could. If we could isolate in the brain the nanosecond of time, that instant of time, when somebody decides to do something, basically what we're talking about now is they did the best they could. So we're not going to waste a lot of time talking about what people should have done or shouldn't have done or whatever. We choose all of our behaviors in an attempt to get what we want. All three people might do something entirely different if they had to do it over again. Sometimes it helps us to look at bizarre situations to understand sort of normal situations. There's a whole field of psychology called abnormal psychology. So I'm going to take a very bizarre situation and just take a look at it. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't pretend to be that skilled in that area. But just to take a look at maybe how some of these things can happen and why people choose some behaviors in a desperate attempt to meet their basic needs. Susan Smith, Union, South Carolina, made the news all over the United States. For a brief instant in her life, she made a tragic decision. And the decision was, and certainly she didn't intellectualize it this way, but she came to a conclusion for a brief period in her life that if I drown my two little boys, if I get rid of my two little boys, I'll have better control, I'll get what I want, I'll be happier, whatever. And as the story unfolded, we began to learn a few things about Susan Smith. One of them was, of course, that she had these two wonderful little boys that she loved dearly. But she also had recently had a boyfriend who basically had told her, now keep in mind, children are very need-satisfying people in our lives. And she had a boyfriend that probably, in many ways, was a very need-satisfying relationship for her. And he had recently told her, apparently, that he wasn't ready to deal with kids. So here she is. She's got these two very important things in her life, both of which are in direct conflict. And she, like any human being, needs to get their needs met. And unfortunately, for a brief instant of time, she decided to do that. Hopefully, and most anybody, with the help from friends and family and our upbringing and what we've been taught and how to solve our problems in our life, we don't do that. But that's the best Susan Smith could do when she did it. We're not excusing the behavior. We're not justifying her behavior. We're talking about why people do what they do. Why do kids do what they do in school? Think about it. Some kids come to school, they have very negative pictures of school. So, since the behavior system we're talking about now is an idea of, our behavior system is a control system rather than a stimulus response system, we understand now why some people do these incredible things that before I was always out here seeing in their outside world trying to force them, make them, and punish them harder and make it more difficult, when in actuality, as I think back on it now, I was playing right into their hand. Because that's what they wanted. Their perception of adults in school is, most of them aren't very nice to me. So those kids are coming to school behaving to have what happen? Adults not be very nice to them. So when that matches up with their perception, that meets their needs. And of course, then you get in that vicious cycle, year after year, day after day. Oh, what are they going to do now? And on and on and on. And then we just pump these things up and we make them more difficult, and so on. And we'll sort of talk about this further as we go along. But let's start off just to watch what can happen in a school and with kids. We're going to start out with a wonderful little 5-year-old kid. Every 5-year-old kid has a picture of school and how they want school to be. And Mary is a 5-year-old girl. She's getting ready to go to school. And she finds out that for kindergarten, she's going to have Miss Endicott. And everybody, of course, what's going on? This happens all over Kentucky. It happens all over the United States. When kids find out who they get for teachers. So Mary spends a lot of time talking to her friends and adults talking to her and ask her, who do you get for kindergarten, Mary? Oh, I got Miss Endicott. Oh, you're going to love Miss Endicott. So all through the summer, she adds all kinds of perceptions or pictures in her mind of how she wants Miss Endicott's kindergarten class to be. She gets there in the fall. It matches up perfectly. When things match up, that's a wonderful feeling. I mean, that feels great. And of course, all through she goes to class or she goes to kindergarten, And she comes home and her mom says, Mary, how was Miss Endicott? Oh, it was great. I got there. She had my name on my desk, my name on my chair, so I don't have to worry about losing my chair. She had under my hook where I'm going to be hanging my coat. She's got my name there, so I don't have to worry about that. And I got all boxed with my pencils and crayons and names. Oh, it was just wonderful. So what happens to Mary throughout her kindergarten year? She adds to her world more and more perceptions or pictures about herself as a student, about school in general, about people who work in school, and a little reader, a little writer, and so on. And then for first grade, she finds out she has Miss Cruz. So glad she got Miss Cruz. She's been right next door to Miss Cruz all year. Miss Cruz already knows my name. So all through the summer, the same thing happens. She adds to her world all kinds of pictures of how it's going to be in her room. She gets there in the fall. It matches up perfectly. Wonderful feeling. And she adds to her world as a little reader, a little writer, a little mathematician. And then she finds out for second grade she's going to have Miss Martin. So glad she got Miss Martin. Miss Martin is a wonderful teacher. Plus, if she hadn't got Miss Martin, she got Miss Grumps across the hall. She's always yelling and screaming at the kids. It was a close call. I mean, that would have really been bad. So all through the summer, she adds to her world again, how it's going to be in Miss Martin's class. She gets there in the fall. It matches up perfectly again. Wonderful feeling. So she sees herself as a reader, a writer, mathematician, scientist. Got to have science lower grades so we can beat the Japanese and the Russians. But all of these things, you see, begin to enter into a kid's world. And then she gets in the third grade. It's to Mr. Offutt. She's going to have a man for a change. That'll be nice. All through the summer, the same thing. Kids are told, oh, you're going to love Mr. Offutt's class. He does some interesting things with local history, and he brings people in to speak to the kids. And sure enough, the same thing happens. School, then, for Mary, is a wonderful place. A very needs-satisfying place for her to go every morning, all day long, all school year. There is a point, however, whether it's ungraded or graded, but there is a point in the curriculum when kids have to begin to read to learn. And sometimes what happens is the Marys come into class and Mr. Offutt says, Mary, I'd like you to go over here and I'd like you to be in Mary Jane and Marilyn's group for reading. And for the first time in her little school career, what her teacher tells her that she loves dearly doesn't match up with her perception of herself as a reader. Because she knows, and everybody in the room knows, that Marilyn and Mary Jane don't read too well. How could I be in with them? This is just like a knife in her heart. And she goes home and her mom says, how was school today? And she says, oh, pretty good, but Mr. Offutt has me in with Marilyn and Mary Jane for reading. Thinking, oh my gosh, her mother's thinking, I better speak to him at Parent-Teacher Conference Day. And if that's 2 or 3 weeks away, that's probably too late. Because most of us in this room knows what happens when kids get put in groups. In the third grade, what group are they in the 7th and 8th and 9th grade? Everybody knows it by then. To me, it's sort of like flying from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. If you get up at your cruising altitude and the computer says you're off by half a degree, the computer automatically on some planes and or the pilot make those tiny little corrections all the way to the West Coast. And amazingly, this vast country of ours, they get out there to the West Coast and they land precisely on a very narrow strip of land on the runway. No problems. But if you get up at your cruising altitude and you're off by half a degree and you have a right brain pilot, says close enough. When you get to the West Coast, you're in Seattle. And for the Marys in school, you see, sometimes we're telling them, this is to help you to get to San Francisco, but she realizes, maybe not. This is painful, this discrepancy here. Or if you wanted to use this diagram, this discrepancy here. So what is she going to do? Well, different kids deal with it differently. She gets on the bus to go home, and Mary's there with her new book that she got when she was put in with Marilyn and Mary Jane, and Ernie's there. Ernie's a 6th or 7th grader, and everybody knows Ernie in school because he's a real troublemaker. And he says, Mary, you in that book? And she says, yes, Mr. Offutt says to help me read better. And Ernie says, well, he put me in that book too. And I got news for you. You ain't going to San Francisco. You're going to Seattle. I mean, this is devastating. So what do kids do when they find themselves in school where they have seemingly no control over these situations? And they have to come to this place called school for 180 days. Mary does something that a lot of us do in our lives. At some point, she takes out of her little picture album up here, if you want to keep using that idea, anything to do with learning to read better. And as soon as she does, the pain of coming to school is diminished dramatically. Why? Because she's not coming to school acting on this world to read any better. It's okay now. I'm not working at this as hard as I was before. And everybody in this room has experienced this in their lives one way or another. People that go through loss, separation, divorce, have to change their perception of themselves, their family, the world around them. I've lost 2 sisters and a brother, 2 at a relatively young age. I had to change the picture of my family. I watched my parents deal with that with 3 of their kids. We all do that. That's the healthy thing to do. And when you have no control, you can't seem to impact on certain things in our lives, then we changed our perception of ourselves, of others, or of school, or of work, or whatever it is. To take care, what? To try and get better control of this world out here. Very important. And that's what Mary has done in the class. Now she comes to school. She finds other ways to meet her needs because reading or whatever it is isn't doing it for me right now. And sometimes those behaviors are what? Rule-breaking behaviors, classroom rule-breaking behaviors, and the things that we have to deal with as teachers and administrators. How we deal with them, of course, is a critical thing for us. When I first started teaching, my first year of teaching, I was teaching 7th and 8th graders, social studies. When I got there in the fall, they also informed me I would be teaching remedial reading. I didn't know anything about remedial reading. After about 2 or 3 days, I overheard somebody in the faculty room say something along the lines of, well, they gave it to the new teacher. Sometimes in our business, the least experienced people end up with some of the most difficult kids to teach. I'm glad they don't do that in medicine. We'd really have a problem. But in education, sometimes that seems to happen. And I'd been warned by the principal that there were 3 teachers in my position the year before, that I'd better stay on top of things, and that these kids were tough, and so on. Well, here I was in a classroom with a bunch of 7th and 8th grade kids, and as I think back on it now, their picture of reading was gone. Which means they're no longer behaving or acting on the outside world, which included me, to read any better. Now, think about what I was doing in their outside world. I'm teaching them to read. They're not behaving to read, but I'm teaching them to read. As a first-year teacher, I'm thinking about this. And that's about all you think about your first year of teaching. You don't care really whether they like me. In fact, sometimes you'll hear people say, I don't smile till Christmas or whatever, those, the old things that float around our business. Okay? And these other things, hey, fun, we got work to do kind of approach to the whole process. So I'm out here in their outside world, and I'm looking up in the catalogs under high-interest, low-level reading material for junior high kids. Do you have any idea how boring high-interest, low-level reading material for junior high kids is? And when I think back on it now, they were good to put up with that nonsense. I thought there were discipline problems at the time, and they were tough. But as I look back on it now, and they were pretty good. 180 days coming and sitting in a room to do something I have no interest in. I'm no longer behaving to control the world to get any better at reading. And we all have done this in different ways in our life. So there they are sitting there, and every day or every other day I'd pass out a story or two to read. Oh, kids, I think you're going to like this one. Time to go over the questions. Okay, kids, let's get out the questions. Mr. Fitz, I forgot mine. Mr. Fitz, I wasn't here yesterday. You want me to go out and sit in the hall while you guys go over what would you want me to do? I mean, these kids would do anything to avoid what? Being wrong. So here I am doing this. They're sitting here, and we're like ships passing in the night. And they would occasionally do some work, but not very often. Now, to survive, what did I do as a teacher? I figured out a little system. And the system was this. I gave certain kids a note or a pass, 2 or 3 kids, never more than 3, to go to Newton's store, just about a 4-minute walk from the school, to buy my lunch. Always gave them a little extra money. In those days, I'm sure it was cigarettes that they bought, but I don't know what it was, but it was something. And as long as I didn't know and they didn't tell me, that was just fine. That's how I survived as a teacher. Because I could get rid of one good troublemaker and maybe one that was sort of down the list a little bit, because I knew then they'd come back. But they came back, not 8 minutes later, not 10 minutes later. It always took those kids 47 minutes to go to Newton's store and get back to my room. And that was just fine with me. That was just fine with me. I mean, we never talked about it, but everybody knew why I was doing it, and the kids knew why I was doing it, and they were happy to play along, and they didn't go tell anybody that he keeps giving kids permission to leave his room or whatever. I was in a survival mode. They were in a survival mode. And if it worked, it worked. As I think back on it now, we would have been better if we'd all gone to Newton's store and sat on the steps and maybe talked and visited a little bit. And maybe by the second year, they might have trusted me enough to be thinking about reading, but not the way I was doing it. It was too painful for them. Too painful. So this theory, then, we have to let go of some things. We have to let go of the idea that we control other people, that I can make you do something. And we have to also realize if we're going to solve problems in school and we're going to start addressing problems, then we need to take a look at this theory. So now we have a common language in the building, in the classrooms. If we're having a problem with a kid, let's define what the problem is. What about the kid's basic needs? The one you have to be careful of is this one, fun. Sometimes we might say about kids, well, he's certainly having enough fun around here. When in actuality, that behavior may have more to do with freedom and belonging and power. And really, some of those kids, school is not fun for them at all, even though we see these very overt disruptive behaviors. School is a painful place for those kids. So that's sort of a tricky one, the last one. But just think about it. Think ahead, or think maybe to a situation where you've dealt with kids, and we're trying to figure out what to do with this kid. Typically, what we want to do, we jump right into what are we going to do to him. Okay, what are we going to do if he doesn't turn in? When we've got to step back even a little bit further and say, well, what about school or my classroom? Is it a need-satisfying place for this kid? And if not, what am I doing? Since I don't control the kid, what am I doing so that I can stay in control of the situation instead of spending all of my energy trying to control something when in reality I don't control it anyway? So we need to rethink some of things. It's hard. It's not easy. I'm not suggesting for a second it's easy. But I think if we begin to look at it in that way, we might be able to solve more of the problems. Because otherwise what happens? As I mentioned earlier, we get a job, we teach, we all come into the building, and then we come up with a bunch of rules and consequences. And it looks great, and it looks great to the public. The only trouble is the kids come. They screw it all up because the kids don't behave according to this recipe, and they don't shape up according to the recipe that we've laid out here. And kids come into school, and of course Ernie comes into school late, and supposedly maybe the offense is supposed to carry a detention or something, and Miss Endicott sends Ernie down to Miss Cruz, the principal, the assistant principal. And Miss Cruz says, Ernie, what happened? He says, well, I remember today it was snowing and the buses were late and I got here and I went out to recess and Mrs. Endicott wasn't there, so I went back in, and by the time I got back in I was late and she was mad, so she sent me down here. So what happens? She says, well, Ernie, sounds to me like you at least tried to do the right thing. I'll give you the benefit today, but after today, that would be a detention if you keep doing that, if you do it anymore. A little later, Miss Endicott comes down to Miss Cruz. What'd you do to him? She says, well, I gave him the benefit of the doubt today because of the snow. The benefit of the doubt? I thought we were going to be keeping these kids after school this year. See, that's the problem. A little later in the day, Miss Martin sends a kid down. Larry was on the same bus with Ernie. Miss Cruz says, well, Larry, what happened? Well, I got here late and I went out to recess and Miss Martin wasn't there and I went back in, then she was upset, so she sent me down here to talk to you. And Miss Cruz thinking, oh, geez, I don't need Miss Martin down here on my case too. So she says, well, I'm sorry, Larry, but you're going to have a detention. Well, how come Ernie didn't have one? Well, I made a mistake with Ernie, and then over the year this will all even out, don't worry, but you've got to stay. So Miss Martin comes down a little later and says, what'd you do to him? She says, well, I'm having him stay for detention, like we said. Well, I just wanted you to talk to him. I didn't want to have him stay after school. I just needed a little support here. So typically, in my experience, that's what happens. We've put up all these things we're going to do. We don't do them because what? We're too much into this idea we got to manage and control the kids all the time instead of addressing basic needs. So let's define what the problem is. And if we define what the problem is, it's a lot easier to solve instead of jumping to the stimulus response kind of approach where we're trying to come up with first offense, second offense, third offense. And I have been in schools because I visit schools constantly, and still today I have to chuckle because I did it all myself. We're still into situations. Literally, I was in a school not too long ago where an assistant principal, he was heartbroken. He says, I'm going to have to suspend one of the best students in our school because she's been late for the 4th time this year. She was late once like in September, once in November, once in January, and it's now near the end of the year, so she's going to get suspended. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. And we lose credibility in the community when we behave like that because, people talk about us. We're a very visible enterprise in the community. And if things aren't working, we ought to really consider stopping it instead of riding, on some of these issues that we've been doing for a long time. I had to change my behavior as a school administrator. Ernie comes down to the office. And I said, what are you doing here, Ernie? Well, Mr. Smith sent me down here. Mr. Fitz, he's nuts. That guy's crazy. Now, what's the first and most important rule in school administration? Support your teachers. Okay? Now, so what would I do in the old days? Oh, Ernie, take it easy now. He's probably having a bad day. Oh, he must have one every day, Mr. Fitz. You should be in that room, you see. Now, because everybody in the building knew Mr. Smith was a little nuts. All the kids knew it. The teachers knew it. The parents in the community knew it. Ernie's sitting in my office with a twinkle in his eye. He knows I know it, but I have to support Mr. Smith at all costs. You see, this is very important in our business. Now think about this. Ernie comes down to my office. His picture of Mr. Smith is nuts. That's his real world, by the way. Perceptions are real. Perceptions are real. It's the facts that are negotiable. So Ernie comes down to my office. His picture of Mr. Smith is nuts. And the first thing I do to Ernie in so many words is tell him, your perception or your picture is wrong. Where does my credibility go with Ernie? Down the tubes. Because I wish, and you have all experienced this, whether we're teachers, administrators, whatever we do, special educators, what a kid, you don't understand. And they're not sometimes too far from the truth, because we do have some people in our business of education that maybe are a little shaky, just like there are in every other profession. There's good ones and bad ones. And once in a while we have to deal with somebody who's a little on the edge. So I would usually give him whatever it says in the handbook. I'd deal it out and make him stay after school or make him apologize or do whatever it is we said we do with these kids. That's hard. And then what happens to his picture of school, his perception of school? Gets worse and worse and worse. So now with this approach, what would I do? Ernie comes down. I have to accept the fact. Okay, Ernie, that's your real world. What are you doing here, Ernie? Oh, Mr. Smith sent me down here. Mr. Fitz, he's nuts. Now what do I do? Okay, I know. But that doesn't mean you can swear at him. Now let's talk about that. You see, I will accept his perception. Okay, fine. He's nuts. You want to believe that? That's okay with me. But you can't swear at him because swearing at teachers here is against the rules. We have a rule about respect, Ernie. You've broken it. Let's talk about it. And we're going to deal with Ernie's behavior instead of all this other stuff. Because I don't have any control over that. In fact, I don't have any control over Ernie. The only thing I control is Jim Fitzpatrick. So let's get something in place here, Ernie, so you can deal with your behavior. And when Mr. Smith comes down to my office, because he always did, he was right down. What you doing, Owen? That's the trouble, and all you're doing is talk to these kids and whatever. And no follow-up. There's not enough follow-up around here. So I talked to him. Well, we have a plan in place, and we're going to deal with it. And if there's any more problems with Ernie and his language in your classroom, I want to know about it, let me know. And by the way, he thinks you're nuts. You see? Now, the reason for that is this. When you think about it, there's only one adult in that school building who will give Ernie reason to change his picture of Mr. Smith, and that is Mr. Smith. Until Mr. Smith starts behaving differently in Ernie's outside world here, he will continue to have this perception of Mr. Smith. And if he is behaving in sort of a nutty way towards Ernie, Ernie is justified in having that perception of Mr. Smith. I don't control it. Sending him to the office. I remember in the old days, my goodness, those kids get sent to the office daily by certain people. Or maybe every other day, but they certainly were in the office every day by somebody sending them there. And I would have to debate and argue with these kids over, you can't be doing this, and you know what it means, and you're going to be after school tonight. Well, I ain't coming. It's not fair. And get into all that kind of, and the energy that you expend on that is just, it's exhausting. I mean, that's why I had to make a choice myself. I'm either going to stay in the business and figure out a different way, or I'm going to get out of the business, because this is silly. The energy we spend on these things. And think about the energy we spend collectively as a faculty in a school. And involving committees and parents on these controlling issues that we have. Rethink, number one, what's our theory? What will we apply when we try and solve these problems? Let's go back to the basic needs. And we understand now that some kids, unfortunately, kindergarten, some kids are coming to school with negative perceptions of school. What we do to these kids in their outside world, kindergarten through 12th grade, either reinforces that perception so that they develop even more, and if you want to use the picture idea, they keep developing more and more pictures about school that are entirely negative and about the people that work there. Or if we can ask ourselves, what are we doing? And maybe even a more important question before we even do that, this would be a wonderful question for a faculty starting out the school year to ask, what do we want? Because sometimes we confuse, the one I had up earlier was about the issue of compliance and discipline. We want both all the time. And sometimes if you want discipline, you may not get compliance. If you want responsibility, you might not get compliance. Because a responsible kid might say, well, wait a minute. Is that really fair? I don't think that's fair. We better talk about this. And sometimes that's when we want compliance. Why don't you just do what I ask you to do, kind of thing. So, someone coming to school with negative pictures, and if we keep doing negative things to them, and eventually that, of course, manifests itself when I dealt with kids, suspensions and these kinds of things, those kids wear suspensions like a merit badge. I mean, those are battle ribbons for those kids. They're very proud of that. And, of course, I, for a long time in the business, couldn't figure out why they weren't shaping up. Because I operated on the assumption that every kid came to school with the same perception of school, and just some of them screwed up more than others. And if I was punitive enough and made life uncomfortable enough for them, eventually they would come around. And I really didn't have much success doing that. In fact, they behaved. I remember Harvey, this kid, I think about years ago, deer hunting. You know, deer hunting season would start on a Saturday. Friday afternoon, he always swore at a teacher. It took me 2 years to catch on. Because in that particular school district, swearing at a teacher was a 5-day suspension. For 2 years, Harvey got 5 days off to go deer hunting. The third year, I caught on. He came in the office. He'd been sent by the teacher. And he said, I swore at the teacher. He's right. You asked him this. And I said, he says, I know you got to suspend me. And I said, yeah, I do. But I'm going to wait 2 weeks till after deer season's over. And he got all upset with, you can't do that. It's not fair. He came in Monday and told me he got his deer on Sunday, so it didn't matter. But so I guess that was, I don't know if that was a win-win situation or not. But I think if we look back at this, use this as our theory, we'll be able to solve a lot more problems than if we're using the old stimulus response approach. We're trying to force and manage people into doing things in school. So that sort of brings us to the end of our first session on why do kids do what they do.